Why are we on this topic of how the pandemic has and maybe in the future impact the church? Someone suggested the topic, and Paul and Mel and I have done our best to really take into consideration your suggestions in our programs this year. And at that very time, last spring or summer, when this was suggested, I immediately thought about Cameron Trimble's article that I sent you ahead of time. And if you've read it, great. If you haven't, we'll take a quick look at it this morning. He wrote it just, I would say, 2 weeks after everything changed in most churches. It was really that third Sunday in March of 2020 when most churches probably went virtual or canceled services or made some major adjustment. So imagine just a couple of weeks after the pandemic hit churches and society, Cameron Trimble came out with 10 ways the pandemic is going to affect the church. And so I thought about that article for this presentation today way back then. A caveat here is we are still in the pandemic, and a lot about how the pandemic will affect the church is still unknown. But it's still good to kind of think about the categories that Cameron Trimble suggests, and then watch as we come out of the pandemic how Trimble's predictions are true or not. And it's true in my life, and maybe yours, that sometimes we see better in the rearview mirror than in that screen looking forward or at the sides. And I think it'd be fun or instructive to revisit this topic a year from now and see where we are at that point. I think we'll know a lot more. And again, our conversations today are more about the church, especially the American church, not just our own congregation, but inevitably as we run through these things, we'll be thinking about Winnetka Congregational Church, and that's okay too. I'd like to set a context for us, which I think is necessary. And the context is what's been the trajectory of the church's health over the last 50, 60 years. And because understanding that context will really form the question for us, which is, will the pandemic accelerate these trends, slow them down, or maybe reverse them, or maybe have no effect at all? But what have been the trends as the pandemic started a year ago? The trend in the American church, and that's all parts of the church. Excuse me as I let a couple people in here. Okay. The trend for the American church, Catholic, Protestant, Evangelical, Protestant, has been decline. Our churches were full of people in the mid-1960s. And there's been a steady decline in the number of congregations and in the number of adherents to organized religion of any kind since the 1960s. I had a wonderful conversation this week with David Shane. He's a national officer in the United Church of Christ, and his area of work is church closures. And he's a very busy executive. The United Church of Christ was formed in 1957, and he noted that except for the first 2 or 3 years of the denomination's existence, membership and the number of congregations has steadily declined. By the way, I know that WCC is not a United Church of Christ congregation, but the 3 clergy serving WCC are, and I think there are inevitable parallels between a church like ours that is a more moderate or even liberal, progressive, mostly white, Protestant, suburban congregation, and churches like United Church of Christ, Presbyterian, and other mainline Protestant suspects like the Disciples of Christ, the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. We are kind of all of the same demographic and even broadly theological similarities. So as the UCC goes, I think we're in that general kind of family. So David Shane shared with me the following 2 graphs. And note, this is a strange graph, but note, and I'll walk you through it, Year 1 on the left side of the graph is 1985. Year 61 on the graph at the far right is year 2045. So it's a projection, right? And year 31 is the year that this graph was put together based on research from the National United Church of Christ. And that was about 5-6 years ago, 2014, 2015. Year 37 on the graph would be today. Ready? Here we go. Okay. Here is the first graph at the top is the number of United Church of Christ congregations. And again, year 1 is 1985 at the far left. So there were roughly 6,500 congregations in the United Church of Christ. Year 61 would be 2045. The projection is just under 4,000 congregations. The hash mark, the vertical hash mark in the center is year 31. That's 6 years ago, 2014, 2015. And then we are at year 37 on this graph, 2021. David says that the projections between 2015 and 2021 have been exactly on target, and that all these projections were done before taking into account the pandemic. UCC membership was, when I was ordained in 1984, it was about 2 million. This says in 1985 at year 1, membership was about 1.7 million. So I'm not sure what the discrepancy is there. Projected out into the future in 2045, membership in the United Church of Christ, which is one of our stalwart mainline Protestant congregations, will probably dip below 200,000 people. And again, you can see the hash mark there at year 31, and where we would be today in the United Church of Christ would be year 37. But remember that this decline did not start in 1985. It started probably in the 60s and with steady declining in the 70s and 80s and onward. We're not going to talk this morning about why there's a decline. I just want to make the case that that's the context in which the pandemic visited us a year ago. But here's some more evidence of the decline. The Pew Forum and Pew Research Center in October 2019, again before the pandemic, suggested that 65% of American adults describe themselves as Christian, which is down a significant 12 points in just 10 years. So in 2009, that number would have been 77%. So just in 10 years, the number of US adults identifying as Christians went down significantly. That's part of this trend. I'm painting this picture for you, I hope, accurately. Where are they going? Many are dying, but others who come along in the new generations are simply not interested in church. And this goes not only for church, but for any kind of organized religion or identification with an existing faith tradition. The religiously unaffiliated, according to Pew, percentage increased by 9% from 17 to 26% from 2009 to 2019. This is not people who don't believe in God necessarily. They're just not interested in organized religion. They have a spirituality, perhaps, or an understanding of spirituality, but they're just not interested in joining a temple, a mosque, a synagogue, a church, or a, quote, religion. And that's 30 million Americans. That's a lot of people. Okay. Among Protestants, that decline was significant, an 8% decline from 2009 to 2019. And among Catholics, it was a smaller decline, but still a decline of 3%. Pew also says that these trends are reflected in church attendance. And you can see all of this on the Pew Research website. their October 2019 research. Pew goes on to say that most white Protestants describe themselves as born again or evangelical. Now consider that for a moment about what that means then for churches like ours that probably do not gravitate to those labels. It means that we are even a smaller share of the white Protestant folks. And even for evangelical Christians, the numbers have declined in terms of affiliation from 2009 to 2019. It's declined by 3%. So if you think that people are running away from liberal churches to join conservative churches, or that young people are attracted to conservative churches, it's probably not the full story. Looking at it generationally, the trend becomes very clear. 84% of people born between 1928 and 1945 identify as Christian, and only 10% unaffiliated with anything. Going a little bit younger into my own generation, the baby boomers, 76% identify as Christian and 17% unaffiliated. So you see that it's starting to tilt more and more from affiliation, Christian affiliation, to affiliated with nothing. Generation X, those born 1965 to 80, 67% are Christian and 25% affiliated. And look at the millennials. 49% identify as Christian, and a full 40% are not identifying as any particular religion. And there are people being born after 1996 as well. And they are even less likely probably to identify with any house of worship or tradition and so on. So here's my grand question then. Will the pandemic exacerbate, accelerate these trends, or have no effect on them? Is it possible the pandemic will slow down or even reverse these trends in American Christianity? So I'd like us to look now quickly at Cameron Trimble's article. Let's see, control and click. All right. Control, click. All right, we may need to do this a different way. Hold on. Let's see. Somebody, I can hear somebody talking. Doggone it. Here, I'm just going to go to the internet and find it. Can everybody still see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. All right, why is it doing that? I don't want to be on Pinterest. Go away. Sorry. There it is. Okay, we don't have time to go through these points in detail, but this is what Cameron Trimble projected would be the impact of the pandemic on the church over the long term, not just during the pandemic, but even after. Doing church online is here to stay. That kind of speaks for itself. Church closures will accelerate. Speaks for itself. Giving in most churches will drop and then might rise again in some. And we're going to look at all these with some other data in a moment. Churches need a new staff structure. And what she means here is traditionally churches hire clergy to be general purpose clergy who interact with people in real time, in real places, not technology savvy clergy. And Cameron's arguing here that in the future, churches will have to hire ministers, digital ministers, media ministers, who know how to connect with people who are not in the same room with you. Okay, that's his point. Number 5, younger generations can finally contribute more engaged leadership. Her thought here was that younger generations are more tech savvy, and so they'll be able to, more eager, in fact, to join, to express their leadership in the local church virtually, because that's the world that they know and live in. Number 6, because churches and their programs are now accessible, we will all church hop, and that's a good thing. So Cameron means here that you can watch WCC at 10, and you can watch your nephew's church in Colorado at 11, and you can watch a church in the UK at 1 in the afternoon. You can church shop and church hop all day long and get out of each one something a little bit different. And Cameron says that's a good thing, but it's going to be a trend that is exacerbated by the pandemic. She says we're creating new liturgies, prayers, and songs, and that we will renew our investment in our local communities. Her thought here is, since we're all staying at home more, we will be more invested in our neighborhoods and towns. That was her thought, not only as individuals, but as congregations. Number 9, we'll see a continued rise in spiritual directors and pastoral counselors working outside of traditional congregational settings. And I think Cameron's idea here was that with churches not meeting in person, people will learn to connect more one-on-one to have their spiritual needs met. And there are some of us, I'm a spiritual director myself, and others who specialize in counseling on behalf of the church, who will be more utilized during the pandemic and maybe even after. And Cameron's last prediction is we'll create new partnerships between evangelical mainline Catholic and New Thought organizations, basically not only within Christianity, but even beyond Christianity, that we're all in it together, and that we'll see opportunities across theological tradition lines to collaborate, do things together. So those were Cameron's 10 points. I'd like to run through now. It's 9:06, we're good on time. Is everybody still with me? Somebody say something.
Amen.
Yes.
Thank you, good.
Looking good.
All right, thank you so much. Good to know that I'm not talking to myself like I usually do. I had an hour-long conversation with Dave Shane. He's not only the United Church of Christ executive for church closures, he's been working at the national level of the United Church of Christ for decades, paying attention to why churches grow, why they decline, what are the social forces beyond the church that's leading to this steady decline, and so on. So I wrote down some of his wise comments to share with you. He points out again, there are no statistics yet for 2020, at least in the National United Church of Christ. Churches are still sending in their statistics. So there's nothing yet to compare 2020 to 2019, but he keeps his ear to churches and pastors, and he has a gut feeling from what he's hearing and the number of calls he's getting is that the pandemic has indeed accelerated the number of church closings, or the number of churches that are considering closing. They may have been considering closing before the pandemic, he said, but the pandemic really said, this is probably more energy to operate in this new environment than we have, and more resources than we have to turn our slow and kind of declining congregation around on a dime. He also made the point that in some ways the pandemic may have slowed actual closing because legally speaking, when you close a church, there's a lot to do that is better done in person, filing court documents and so on. And some churches may say, well, after the pandemic, we'll pick up the pace in terms of maybe merging or shutting down. Dave suspects that churches will be expecting a post-pandemic bump in attendance. It's like when we all get back together, everything's going to be great. He suspects that that may not materialize. And if it does not, at least in terms of in-person attendance, old-fashioned church is done in the building, he says that then churches may start to say, oh, we're only 70% of what we used to be. We're only 80%, we're 50%. Can we really go on, or what changes do we need to make to go on? Dave says the pattern of non-attendance has developed in this year, right? We've all learned that you don't have to be in the building to go to church. Churches need to continue having an online presence. And so a lot of people who could come into the building on a Sunday may say, well, I've learned this last year, I don't have to do that, so I'm just going to Zoom in with the congregation. I asked David if PPE and other federal pandemic interventions, fiscal stimulus, and so forth may have stemmed the tide or provided short-term relief. He says that that may be true. And Jeffrey speaking here, I happen to know of a congregation that in March of last year said, we have enough money to get us through till June. And after that, we're going to have to close. This is a long-standing, vital congregation on Chicago's South Side. But they got PPE, and that tided them over. And they had people tuning into their Zoom that they didn't even know who were giving them money. So there have been all kinds of surprises with the pandemic, and some of them have been sort of life-sustaining for congregations. Zoom has generated more people attending in most churches. I hear this in all the clergy I talk to, and David does too. And more different kinds of people. What do we mean different kinds of people? We mean people we don't know. Relatives maybe, or just people who've heard about our church, drove by our church and said, I wonder what goes on in there. And here's a chance for me to find out without actually have to going into the building. Maybe younger people too, maybe different demographics in terms of race and religious background. Here's my point I would like to insert into this, if I may. I have noticed in our congregation, and this has got to be true in every congregation, in this last year, normal attrition has not stopped. That is people dying, moving away, and increased frailty in some members that will no longer allow them to attend as regularly as they used to attend in person. And most churches have not received new members in this last year. So that's all a net draw on your bottom line number of members. And remember that 1 out of 660 Americans have died due to COVID. And that has definitely reduced membership in some congregations, just that alone. So David says, will people come back? He says, get ready for a new world. They'll come back, but only through online, not through the doors. And that's why churches will have to have a vigorous online presence after the pandemic. What about money? David said financial data for 2020 is not available yet in terms of UCC congregations, yet it's his general impression that giving seems to have been sustained in 2020 over 2019. I would say that is quite true at Winnetka Congregational Church. On the positive side, David sees that there's more collaboration between local churches and conferences, and between conferences in the national setting. Conference in the United Church of Christ is a broad geographic group of churches, like the Illinois Conference. There's a sense that we're in it together, and we've really got to lean on each other and help each other and train each other in the skills that we need to make it through this. So Cameron's point number 5 was that young people will rise to leadership in churches because of the pandemic and the accessibility of technology. Dave says this is true, but only if churches had younger people to start with. And by younger people, we mean people under 40. And in some churches, that's true. In a lot of churches, the people under 40 are hard to find. Cameron's point number 8 was about churches being engaged in their local communities. And Dave made the point that if you're a young adult, and you might say any adult, and you're not convinced that the church you're looking at is involved in the community, building allies and creating relationships, not just seeking new members, but really invested in its local communities, then people are not likely to be interested in that church. It's like, why should I go to that church if that church's only purpose is to keep itself going without regard for the welfare of its immediate community? Okay, we're almost done with David's points here. Oh, and Cameron's point 10 is the sense of being in together. It's David's sense that this extends beyond faith communities of our own type, and even Christian communities. That a lot of progressive houses of worship, whether they're Muslim, Jewish, or Christian, are seeing common purpose now, especially, this is David's point, with the very evident rise of Christian nationalism. There's been a lot of conversation about Christian nationalism being one of the factors behind the January 6th riot at the Capitol. Here's some research from the Church of the Nazarene. The Church of the Nazarene is an international North and South America denomination. It's evangelical, but they surveyed 2,191 clergy in early October through November. I have highlighted in red some of the main points that they found. Despite challenging conditions, the majority of Nazarene congregations worldwide are adjusting to the conditions presented by the pandemic. Overall, Nazarene clergy feel optimistic about the future and are confident that their congregations will emerge stronger from the pandemic. Financial impact, a majority of pastors agreed, almost 70%, that the pandemic has put the financial viability of their congregation at risk. If you look in the black bullet point there underneath that, the suggestion is that in Central and South America, or Mesoamerica, congregations and clergy were more likely to agree than in US and Canada. Almost half disagreed with that statement, but that also means half of Nazarene clergy felt that there was financial risk in their congregations due to the pandemic. And then the last bullet point there is the obvious point that the smaller the size of the congregation, the more likely they are to be at financial risk. And again, this is the Church of the Nazarene. When asked whether the ministries of their congregation face an uncertain future due to the pandemic, respondents were divided evenly between those who agreed and those who disagreed. And then the last bullet point there in bold red, a large majority of pastors, 88%, agreed that their congregation has identified and embraced new opportunities for ministry since the pandemic. I'd like to insert a comment here. I am a coach in the Illinois Conference United Church of Christ to 2 congregations that are struggling. I meet with them once a month, the pastors some month, and then their leadership teams in other months. My experience with these 2 congregations and then other struggling congregations in the Illinois Conference is they're waiting for the pandemic to be over before engaging their communities. They are having trouble envisioning ways that they can be helpful in their communities now. And as a coach, I'm saying to them, can you think a little bit deeper here about some people you can talk to in your communities, about some real needs that are happening right now? Can you maybe have some conversations with some other allied organizations in town about some ways that you can be relevant right now? And they just kind of look at me like, no, we just can't do anything until all this is over. And yet here's a group of more evangelical pastors who have embraced new opportunities for ministry. So I think the success of churches relative to the pandemic may be due to their ability to be creative during this time and see ways of plugging into their communities that are meaningful to the communities, rather than just sitting on your hands and waiting till everybody's vaccinated and we're just all back to normal. Okay, I do have another thing to show you, but I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment because I've been talking a long time. And maybe hear a bit from you. What I have to show you is what I found just late last night, and that is a National United Church of Christ report that just came out in December about how the pandemic is affecting United Church of Christ congregations. But let's take a break right now and hear from you. Flurry?
I was on a sorority Zoom yesterday with friends from across the country. There were about 15 of us. And my friend who lives in Rockford mentioned that she had been on a Zoom meeting with people from 15 different Lutheran churches in the Rockford area discussing this very topic of how they had adapted to the pandemic with the technology, and she sensed that they were all going to keep parts of the technology services and whatever going forward, and how would they do this and how could they all benefit from each other. And I guess this is going to be a series of, I don't know, at least 2, if not more, sessions with, many people who could Zoom in. Like,
so every church I know, including WCC, is saying what we're doing now, we're going to have to continue, and we're going to have to be hybrid in a sense. Everything we do in person is probably going to have to be done virtually, because we've gotten used to, in the last year, snowbirds in Florida. I'm not talking about the Doubtings, but maybe you can be with us for worship. You can be with us for spiritual enrichment and First Friday, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do we want to go back to the world where you have to be in the building to participate?
Well, aren't the buildings a huge expense to congregations? I mean, like we have Congregation Hakava meet for their high holidays in our building. My sister-in-law is a member of a very small Jewish congregation out in the Crystal Lake area. They've never had a building, and she is the person, they don't even have a rabbi. She is the person who performs the Shabbat and everything, and always has when they would, meet. But now she's doing it online, and she said, man, that she has more people attending online, and she loves it. She does it from her own kitchen. my brother films it,
Yeah.
So there's definitely some pluses.
Every clergy group I go to, New Trier, United Church of Christ, everything, the report is uniform. You have more people participating now than before, and it's all because of online. And JS, yes, please.
I think Paul was before me. I'll go after Paul.
Okay, JS, thank you. To the point of new people being attracted because it's available through the internet. We had a new couple move in down the street and just happened to be stopped and talking to them a few months ago. And one of them said, you guys belong to the Winnetka Congregational Church, don't you? And we said, well, yes. How'd you know that? They said, well, we've been tuning into the services, and apparently there was some service where our picture appeared. And so it gave us an opportunity to talk a little bit about the church. Of course, brag it up and everything, but again, if it wasn't for the internet and they were searching around for a church, I think they had looked at 2 or 3, and ours was one of them, which is good. So there's opportunity there.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, JS?
From my own personal self-centered perch, this couldn't have come soon enough. I am so grateful that the church has embraced the technology and sees this as an avenue for being able to demonstrate what we are all about to a larger audience and learn how to grow through this. As Christians, as members of communities, as members of families, I think it's opened up a whole set of avenues that even when things move towards something that resembles more like 2018, but not really, because everything will change. It's my hope that we all change in ways that bring us deeper depth as individuals and together about what our faith means and what spirituality means. I look at this as having vast opportunities for each of us individually and collectively.
And I think what's happened with churches pivoting toward online in the pandemic should remind us that we should have been doing this all along. And we weren't, most of us. And have to, and so we are. But we should have been doing it before, because the world's been online for a long time. And there have been people on vacation or who are homebound who have not been able to participate before. And now they can more fully. And we should have been more attentive to that, and long time ago. But now we are, because we have to be, and it's a good thing. So my framing question again is, now I'll come to Jean. My framing question is, will the pandemic accelerate the downward trend of white mainline Protestant progressive congregations? Will it slow it down? Will it reverse it? Will it have no effect? There's a rector of a local Episcopal church who attends our new Trier clergy group. He's feeling that the pandemic has created such a sort of a psychic, spiritual shift in people, or a sense of inwardness and aware of what's really important in our lives, that it may actually boost attendance and boost participation and affiliation in his church and in other churches after the pandemic. That's a very hopeful view. Jean?
Maybe. So that's my thinking is, and at the risk, because I don't want another assignment or to be on another group right now, but I think that the situation that you describe is not similar to what the Strategic Planning Committee looked at when we were considering 2020, right? The 2020 vision. Well, 2020 vision blew right by. So now here we are in 2021. But I think it will continue to diminish if our products and our means of connecting don't change. And I think, if I think about WCC, we've shifted a little bit to respond to the pandemic, but we have not shifted enough our overall product suite. We need to invest in different skills, like you said, in our pastors, and we need to think about our infrastructure in a completely different way in order to meet that challenge if we want to connect to people. So when I say products, I think about things like Daily Bread, So Daily Bread was at the beginning of the pandemic a really important connection for people to help manage the anxiety. Well, that anxiety and issue hasn't, a level of it has embedded, but there are other issues that are coming, and yet we're not speaking to that. We've turned that channel off when we should be turning that channel up as a pipeline into connecting. And then how are we're not forming new groups or new connections online to try to embed people into our community in a way that we could be. So my answer to your broader question is maybe only if we continue to change. And to your earlier point, the time is now. We should have a strategic group up and running that's already thinking about these shifts and the impacts on the organizational structure, the financial structure, the physical structure of the church.
Thanks, Gene. Yes,
And
Chuck?
to your point, I think that needs to be populated primarily with people under 35.
Can I ask a question? Do we have any data? I thought we had hired a marketing company. We've spent a whole year now with this new model. Do we have any data? I mean, we should know what's working and what isn't working. And because you have, the internet has the ability to count how many people are watching and where they're from. So I'm sort of surprised that there's no use, Winnetka Congregational Church data. We should have some.
At the last council meeting, Christy mentioned that that's being aggregated right now.
Because we should know whether Daily Bread worked or not. We should know whether spending so much time on making a perfect YouTube Sunday worship service, is that really drawing more people, or is it consuming too much of our ministerial time and not having any result in attracting more people? So
I definitely refer you to Christy with that question, Chuck. It's a very good question. Yes, Fleury?
We've seen that happen at Erica's Lighthouse. I think most of you would know about Erica's Lighthouse. It's a not-for-profit that educates the community, young people, teachers, about adolescent depression. And for probably the first, 8 years, everything pretty much was done by volunteers and one paid person. And we now have probably 5 under 30 people who have been over the last 3 years or so, 4 years, just done all this technology. They can tell you how many thousands of people clicked onto a specific thing that they have put on, the website. And our programs now are in, I think, 40 different states and 3 different countries. And it's all because of the technology, and that everything, all our handbooks, everything are free and online, and people can download them. And it's amazing. And, I am not very techy, so, I just am in awe of what they can do and how quickly they can do it. They're not intimidated at all. It's, we can do this, and it's done.
Thanks.
So
I would like to
here's some people like that.
I would like to take us back to kind of a balcony view in which our own congregation finds itself as a part of. And that is a recent, very interesting demographic study that came out of the National Research Office of the United Church of Christ. It was just published recently, a few weeks ago. And I'd like to run through it real quick. We might have some time to have some conversation about that. I'm going to screen share first this time. Okay. Hold on here. Let's see. Oh, I know what I need to do. I am probably not going to be that tech pastor that you've heard about today.
But you can be the connection pastor all day long.
That's nice. Here we go. All right. December 2020, this report came out from the National Research Office of the United Church of Christ. And you can read a little about the methodology here. 345 clergy responded out of 823 that were sent a survey, which I think is 42% return is pretty good for research. So in-person worship, here's the number of congregations that stopped in-person worshiping, 95%. Have you resumed worshiping in person? That's kind of all over the map, but mostly it was no. This is, again, this research was done, by the way, in August or September, but the report came out in December. These are about the precautions and very specific kinds of ministries. And here's about online worship. Is your church holding online worship during the pandemic? 86% answered yes. Now, how many churches did online worship before COVID? 91% did not, only 9% did. Online worship, churches worshiping online pre-pandemic. So this is the very small number who were worshiping online beforehand, and they are reporting a 90% increase in their attendance, their online attendance, because they were already online worshiping before the pandemic. The question here is, do you plan to continue using online technology that you started using for the first time during the pandemic? This is significant. 77.5% say yes. All the pastors and churches I know are saying yes to this question. Interesting, 10% of churches did not implement any new online technology due to COVID-19. Online worship platforms. Here's the way that churches have been trying to reach their members and the public. Most have been using Facebook and Facebook Live, followed by YouTube, which is what WCC is doing for worship. And then some churches are doing Zoom worship. So it's kind of spread out there. Online worship attendance. Here is comparison between pre-pandemic and post-pandemic or during pandemic in-person worship attendance compared to pandemic. 36%, 35.5% report somewhat more, and then 17% report much more. So again, that adds up to, who's a good math person here, 35.5 plus 16.5, that's over 50%, isn't it? About 52% have registered more attendees in person online than they had before. And about the same is 18%, and somewhat less or much less would be about 30%. Who attends online worship? Now, this is a select all that applies, so these numbers add up to more than 100%. But note that current members, of course, is almost 100%, which you would expect. And family and friends of current members, that's a reasonable graphic of people who would tune in. That accounts, that's like almost 90%. But then look at the number of people interested in becoming members. That's what you might call prospective members. And then people who had previously had no connection to your church. is at almost 70%. So online is a significant way of reaching out to people who are not attending regularly. Alternatives to online, some churches that are not worshiping online use these means for reaching people. And here's about gathering and giving. This is about Christian education for youth and children at the top and adults at the bottom. You know, what's interesting to me is the very last bar in each graphic. That is, was not offered in person. That means before the pandemic, they didn't have Sunday school. That's a lot of churches. It's almost 30%. And then also about 30% of churches didn't even offer any kind of adult education before the pandemic. But most churches have shifted whatever they were doing education-wise online, whether that's for children and youth or adults, 45% for youth and 47% for adults. Committee meetings, most have moved online. Bible studies, most of those have moved online. Outreach groups, I'm not sure what that means. If that means fellowship groups or mission groups. But again, 40% of those have moved online. A shocking 27% had no outreach groups even before the pandemic. Again, we wonder why our churches are struggling. Changes in outreach. Has your congregation continued or expanded your outreach to the community or other kinds of social engagement? 70% say yes. Now that's continued or expanded. Expanded would be better than continued, but at least they've continued where they were. But again, that's a fairly large number. 30% of congregations have not continued or expanded community outreach. That means they've really pulled back. This is not the time to do that, probably. Changes to giving, the financial reality here. Giving has stayed the same. That's about 40% of congregations. Giving has decreased about 35%. Giving has decreased significantly. It's about 7%. So it's kind of equally divided between whether giving has had a negative, a positive, or no effect on churches, which is kind of all over the place. Now, Cameron predicted that giving would take a hit during the pandemic and might return after the pandemic. I think the results have been a little bit better than that from this graphic and just my own ears and eyes on the broader church, perhaps because of all the government stimulus and because of PPE, which has really helped a lot of churches. And there's a question about PPE down here, hope we can get to in a moment. Electronic giving. Many churches, almost 50%, offered electronic giving before the pandemic. 8% are considering it now. 30% do not offer electronic giving, but 14.25% have started making electronic giving available to their members since the pandemic. Here's the PPE question. 55% of the churches applied for PPE. So that's why I think PPE was very helpful in keeping a lot of our churches going in 2020, which kind of makes you wonder when PPP is over, what will happen to those churches that were relying on PPE. Impact on clergy. This is where clergy go for their guidance about what to keep open, what to close. Clergy support. What kind of help do clergy need? 60% say technology. Help! Pastoral care strategies, that's how to help church members during the pandemic. And you can see the other things there. Most helpful support for clergy actually came from church members. Thank you, church members, for helping to support your clergy through this last year. And then help from their conference and other local clergy. I think a lot of clergy turn to each other when they need help. That's my experience. Pastoral care for clergy, again, clergy colleagues have provided a lot of that help. Okay, concluding thoughts, you can see them here. Our churches have had to adapt to ongoing change while also continuing to be the church in new ways. The rapid shift toward online worship and ministry gatherings has been one of the most profound impacts of the pandemic. Given the central role that technology has served across churches during this time, this is not surprisingly the area where clergy identify as needing the most assistance. So that's a major report from one of the stalwart old line, main line, some call it now sideline Protestant congregations. We have just a minute or two if you'd like to. There's some great comments in the chat. I don't know if I have time to read them all. Junia, we haven't heard from you. Yes.
There are a number of community organizations that we can partner with, and that we haven't talked about that. I hope we're going to have another chance to discuss this because I think this is really exciting. Both online possibilities as well as actual working together with other organizations. I don't want to go any further because I know we don't have much time, but I hope we can discuss that in the future.
Yeah. Well, our collaboration with the within the New Trier Multi-Faith Alliance has continued. It seems
but that can grow, and we can pay a lot more attention to that and to some other things in the anti-racism, and there are a lot of different things we can actively participate with.
Yep, yep.